The second presenter tonight is Ira Longini. I love Ira's presentations. I mean, they are just they're wonderful. They've got all these things like computer games and all this kind of stuff, but it's serious business what the message is. But Ira is currently a professor of biostatistics at the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Institute. He's also a professor of biostatistics at the University of Washington. He specialized in mathematical and statistical theory of epidemics, a process that involves constructing and analyzing mathematical models of disease transmission, disease progression, and the analysis of infectious data based on these models. I never thought I'd have any interest in anything like this, I have to tell you. Anyway, Dr. Longini has worked on the analysis of epidemics in influenza, HIV, cholera, dengue fever, rhinovirus, rotavirus, tuberculosis, measles, and other infectious agents, which means you may want to stay 6 feet away from him as well. And you may recognize him, actually, because Ira has been written up in the Wall Street Journal and a number of other international publications for his expertise in the topic he's going to discuss with you tonight. Ira.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to talk about the transmission control of pandemic influenza, but everything I have to say also applies to seasonal influenza and all influenza, since we don't have to really put up with this disease if we don't have to. And maybe this is a good opportunity to start dealing with it. We have within the, I should mention, we have basically a new center called C-Squid, which straddles all these organizations, Center for Statistical and Quantitative Infectious Diseases. She thought it's a really good Seattle name. And this is a group of people that we have working on pandemic flu, kind of straddling the hutch in the university. It's a combination of professors and staff scientists, students, postdocs, and so on. I want to start with a few quotes about flu because I've been studying and trying to deal with flu for 35 years now, and everybody knows Einstein's favorite quote that God does not play dice with the universe, and I'm just adding this. This is me. This is the only case I know of. And there's another quote, if you've seen one influenza epidemic, you've seen one influenza epidemic. And so this is an extremely difficult disease to predict and deal with. And I think I'll get some of those ideas across. We have two recent publications. The first one really deals with the live and killed vaccines that Corey talked about. How effective are they for seasonal flu? Who do they protect? Who don't they protect? And how do they protect? And when the pandemic broke out, we had some time to morph this paper to cover pandemic flu as well. And then a second paper, which came out recently in Science that we published, which has a great deal of information I'm going to give you now. So just a few things on the global pandemic. As you might, I'm going to give you the 40,000-foot view that Banks mentioned first, and then we'll hone in on what we can do right now. But the first cases, as far as we know, at least as far as reporting, emerged in Mexico. I was sitting around my office in late March worrying about avian H5N1 flu, and I got a call actually from the CDC saying, hey, guess what? You didn't contain anything. You guys said you were going to contain this, and you and WHO, and there's thousands of cases in Mexico. So that's kind of how I found out about it. By the time I heard anything about this, there were already thousands and thousands of cases. And then quickly after that, we saw the first cases in the U.S. Mexico acted very rapidly with all these social distancing measures and probably slowed their epidemic quite a bit. But just like us, they were coming out of their flu season at the time. During April and June, cases spread within weeks throughout the planet. And slowly but surely, by June of 2009, WHO declared an influenza pandemic. They could have declared the pandemic probably in late April of 2009, but it finally kind of hit the official definition about that time. So currently, as mentioned, since April, we have at least 300,000 confirmed cases and 3,900 deaths. So we're seeing about a 1 in 10,000 case fatality ratio. And no matter how you adjust this, we've been looking at it in the U.S. and everywhere else, we continue to see this. So it's not a particularly virulent virus, but as Corey mentioned, the people dying are not necessarily in the risk groups you expect. It's become the dominant virus wherever it invades and becomes established, and we will have to see whether it completely replaces the seasonal H3N2 and the seasonal H1N1. My guess is that it will. And as mentioned, I've just relisted the high-risk groups for this virus. I thought Corey was going to talk about the basic reproductive number, but you pulled that slide out. So let me just mention the basic reproductive number we call R0 is the average number of people a newly infected person infects in a completely susceptible population over their entire infectious period. So, for example, the R0 for measles, the most infectious disease known to humans, is 18. So, every newly infected child in a fully susceptible population would infect on average 18 other people, but it has about a 2-week incubation period. So you get those 18 people every 2 weeks. Influenza is typically less than 2. But it has an extremely short, we call serial interval, of about 3 days. So if somebody's infected and they infect somebody else, that other person becomes a case on average 3 days later. So even though the reproductive number sounds small, it spreads very fast. And so this is a slide courtesy of Neil Ferguson. We've had our first look at an entire season in the Southern Hemisphere. And these are the estimated reproductive numbers in the Southern Hemisphere countries which have just come through their flu season. Their flu season peaks in July, which is their winter. And you can see New Zealand about 1.3, Australia about 1.2, Australia very low, another location Australia. Argentina about 1.8, Brazil about 1.4, and Bolivia about 1.4. So this makes it, in most cases, a quite transmissible virus. And Ferguson's group in Imperial College is guessing now that the R0 for this virus is about 1.3 to 1.4. Now, I'm going to talk, about mathematical models and the projections we're making. And the first model is a global model of 155 of the world's largest population centers. It's got a system of probabilistic equations written for the epidemic for each of those population centers that has all the natural history parameters that we know about for H1N1, and then it's connected through the global transportation network. The epidemic starts getting very large in the major population centers in the Southern Hemisphere. Throughout the tropics, it's just depending on who they're connected to. And now we're coming into August and school openings in the United States and in Europe and other parts of the temperate northern hemisphere. And, we're starting to see outbreaks in the United States. And now we're coming into October, and you can see what's happening. This is with an R0 of 1.3, so we backed off a little bit. And then, that's basically the first planetary wave of this pandemic over a 1-year period. And so that's what we're expecting to see. And this is what the CDC surveillance for influenza, these are the proportion of cases that are influenza-like illness and in various sentinel physicians' offices and clinics throughout the country. When this gets above about 2.5, we usually have flu epidemics. And you can see this year, this is the epidemic we always see. This was the spring, and this was the week ending October 3rd. See, and this is the 2 years before. And you can see they follow the pattern. It's very different than we're seeing now. This blip here corresponds almost perfectly with the opening of schools in different parts of the country, first being in the southeast in early August, and now all the schools are open. And so we had this initial burst in the schools, and now it's starting to go up. This is the Google trends, which is a combination of that kind of information plus Google keystrokes, actually developed by a former student of mine, Rajan Patel, who's there. And that's showing more or less the same thing. It's more up to date. This is as of a few days ago. And we see a rapidly increasing epidemic in the United States. We could peak as early as maybe late October. So, it could be a bit later. We don't know exactly. Okay. Statistically, we have been able to estimate from family studies how transmissible this virus is. And the science paper from the early data from households, we were estimating a household secondary attack rate of about 27%, which puts this virus in the quite transmissible region. That means about a quarter of people infected in households at least if you're in a household with an infected person, there's about a 25% chance that person will infect you. In the school, we've analyzed one large outbreak that occurred in New York City, St. Francis Prep School, and we got a local R of 2.4. So that's every child infected on average 2.5 other children. So we're guessing, based on that information, some others, that the R0 is in the 1.3 to 1.7 region. This shows various R0s and the proportion of the planet's population, so the percentage that will eventually become ill, not infected, but ill. And so if you believe the R0 is about 1.3, we're talking about a quarter of the world's population, about 1.7 billion people. And if you think it's 1.6, it's about a third of the world's population, about 2.4 billion people. And then, as I said, we're seeing roughly a case fatality ratio of 1 in 10,000. So you can do the numbers for yourself. I stay away from global mortality. But depending on what we finally understand the R0 to be, we could be in any of these regions for either low or moderate or highly transmissible pandemic strain. Okay, so I'm going to finish my talk by talking about the vaccines. We're very heavily into the vaccines at this point. So this is a general statement by me. And I believe that regardless of face masks, social distancing, antivirals, we've worked with all these things. We looked at data like Corey presented. So far, none of these have been effective in really stopping spread. They've slowed spread a bit. Probably the most effective thing you can do is close down schools. And so all these non-pharmaceutical interventions have been somewhat effective out of season. None of them have had any real impact on the epidemic, any populations that were in their epidemic season. So we have the vaccines coming. They're both inactivated and live vaccines, as mentioned, Flumist being the live vaccine. They've all gone through phase 1 and phase 2 safety and immunogenicity studies, and they appear to be roughly as immunogenic as seasonal vaccines. It looks like one dose will be sufficient for adults, although I don't necessarily believe that, and that after vaccination, one reaches at least hemagglutinin titers that are considered protective, at least partially protective after 8 or 10 days. But for children, anybody 9 years and under, it looks like 2 doses are required. 1 dose is not immunogenic enough to get any real level of protection. Maybe they'll get halfway. And so for them, it will take 1 dose to get some protection, maybe 8 to 10, 2 weeks later. You get the second dose 21 days later, and it wouldn't be till around 28 days later that they were fully protected. This is just a very fast slide from one of the vaccine trials. This is a CLS killed vaccine trial in Australia. And these are the antibody titers, and these are the proportion of people that have those titers. So the further out you are out here, the better off you are. 1 in 40 or better is considered protected. So people in this region are somewhat protected. This arm had 2 dosage levels. And unfortunately, in this population, there was a fair amount of antibody before they ever did the trial. And they did the trial in the middle of the flu epidemic. But after 1 dose, this is what happened. It shifted people, and almost everybody had at least a 1 in 40 titer. This just shows the 2 age groups, and you can see the younger age group had a much better response than the older age group, as mentioned earlier. So what are we going to have in this country? We have everything. These are all killed vaccines from Sanofi, Novartis, CSL, and GSK, and here is the live vaccine. So we're going to have roughly 251 million doses, and 10% of that is pledged to WHO. This is the rate at which we're getting the vaccine. So we started getting vaccine in October, and this just shows the number of doses in millions that we'll be getting over time. Total, this is of the live vaccine, the red. These multi-dose vials, Corey, these are the ones with thimerosal in them. They have to be because there's more than 1 dose in them. And these other vials, the pre-filled syringes are pediatric. They're 7.5 micrograms. And those are ones that are thimerosal free or only have traces of thimerosal. So we're not going to have a lot of vaccine or a lot of coverage until we get well into December. We've looked at 2 scenarios, either the 1.6 scenario with the epidemic. The larger the R naught, the faster the epidemic peaks, as well as the more intense it is. And with a 1.6, we could very well see a peak by late October, or if we got lucky in November. If it's 1.3, then we're probably not going to see a peak in late October. It'd probably be sometime in November or December, just by mechanics. It simply can't spread that fast. So here we are. The red shows our coverage. This is the early 1.6 peak. We get lucky, and it's 1.6, the somewhat later peak. And this is the 1.3 earlier peak and the 1.3 later peak. And so obviously, if this happens, vaccine's not going to do much. So this shows, we get up to about 70% coverage by the end of February. So running the simulator with an R naught of 1.6, this shows under these different strategies, we can either give everybody vaccine as fast as we can, which we're not doing. We can vaccinate the high risk first, and then everybody, which will be this. Or we can vaccinate the high risk first. Then this is also essential workforce. Then cover children. Then cover everybody else, which I think we should do, but has very little effect if the R naught's 1.6 and we see a late October peak. If we see a later peak and it's 1.6, then all of these strategies would cut the spread quite a bit. The best being vaccinating high risk and essential workforce, then coming into vaccinating the children, and then everybody else. And then this is a 1.6 scenario if there's a December peak, and we would absolutely, with the current amount of vaccine, and given people would take the vaccine, Hane was mentioning that maybe everybody wouldn't take vaccine, but if everybody did, it was offered, we'd end up with a very mitigated epidemic. This are the 1.3 scenarios. Again, with vaccine, with a peak in November, we would reduce the epidemic from there to there. And then if we got lucky and had a December peak, then we'd pretty much eliminate spread entirely. This is a movie showing, the upper shows what I showed you before if we do nothing. And the bottom shows the optimal. This is universal vaccination. If we have a December peak, so you can see, as I said, how spread occurs if nothing is done, versus what the country would look like under that scenario. So we cut the overall attack rate by about 2/3 if we do that. And this second movie shows the child first strategy after covering high risk and essential workforce, and if we were lucky enough to have a December peak. And you can see a very well mitigated epidemic. Again, you can see the epidemic finally hitting very intensely these various population centers, and if you were going to do this strategy and you were lucky enough to have this happen, this is what you'd see instead. This isn't even a seasonal, epidemic. This is a very small epidemic. Okay, now, as you know, as I mentioned, we may be peaking another week or two, and we certainly don't have enough vaccine at this point to do that optimistic scenario which I just showed you. What we could do, though, is we could go ahead and do these non-pharmaceutical interventions. We could close the schools, have people stay home from work as much as possible. While we close the schools, by the way, we have to have some kind of partial household quarantine, and then also practice all these other social distancing measures that Corey mentioned. And if we did that, this is doing nothing. This is vaccinating, just vaccinating. If we were going to have this October peak, but this curve is what we would have if we just did those social distancing measures just for a month. Okay, close the schools for a month. In other words, if we didn't let them open in September, we would get an epidemic that looks like that. It's shifted about a month to the right. Okay, and then if we vaccinated after that, we could save our rear ends. Okay. By the way, we're not doing that, so forget that. Okay. Okay, so I think I will stop. We're not closing the schools. We're not doing social distancing. We're not doing any of that. We're just watching the epidemic sweep the country, and we're trying to vaccinate as fast as we can, even though the vaccine's late, hoping upon hope that maybe the peak will come later. Okay, so let me just summarize by saying that, the later the peak, the whole thing, it's a race now between the vaccine and the peak. And that's what's going to determine everything. And that if we really do peak in October, the current vaccines are going to have very little effect on this wave of the epidemic. As far as strategy goes, I think we should always concentrate on children, because they're the people spreading the virus. And in fact, in many of these scenarios, you can protect more high-risk people by vaccinating children than you can by going after the high risk directly if you have limited quantities of vaccine. We're not going to deploy these non-pharmaceutical interventions, even though we spent the last 2 years preparing to do just that. But we probably should just keep vaccinating anyway, no matter what happens, because typically in 1957-58 and 68-69, the two big pandemic introductions, we saw increased morbidity and mortality for 2 to 3 seasons after the initial season. So getting people primed, at least with a single dose of vaccine now, will make our job a lot easier next fall when we have to deal with this virus again. And we may be dealing with a second wave in the winter, which we've seen several times. Last time we saw a big second wave was in the 57-58 pandemic, which did peak in mid to late October, but then came back in January with another peak. So I'll stop there, and thank you for your time and patience.